Salam, peace be upon you, Rafiq. Part 46, Irreducibility Theorem, Formal. Reducing phi uses phi. Where we just came from, Part 45. We installed the Exhaustiveness Theorem. Phi is the only coherent ground for public science. Any deeper than phi foundation either smuggles phi back in or becomes operationally meaningless. The alternatives collapse into two failure modes: circularity or silence. Where we are now, part 46, we seal an even stronger result. Phi is not only the only coherent ground, it is formally irreducible. Any attempt to reduce phi to something more primitive must either use phi-like distinctions, making the reduction circular, or become inexpressible, making it non-scientific. Every statement of the form phi is really x either translates back into phi language or fails operationally. Where we are going next, part 47. We will use this irreducibility to complete the backpack check, the completeness proof. Before differentiation, we verify we have every prerequisite for a readable universe without adding new primitives. Then we can hand off into dynamics as a justified step, not a leap. A brief note: the formal mathematical works behind these concepts can be found on Zenodo by searching for Holophase. Imagine you're holding the simplest possible tool in your hand. Not a hammer, not a knife, not a measuring tape. A tool that is even more basic than tools. It is the ability to tell this from that. The ability to say same or different. To say here, not there. To say yes, not no. To say one thing rather than another. That is phi, not a thing among things, but the capacity for distinction that makes thinghood and comparison possible in the first place. Now we ask a dangerous question. We ask, can we reduce phi? Can we say phi is not fundamental? It's really something else? Because science loves reduction. Science has built magnificent towers by reducing heat to molecular motion, light to electromagnetic fields, chemistry to quantum structure. So the temptation is natural. If we can reduce everything, why not reduce phi too? Part 46 answers with a firewall. You cannot reduce what makes reduction possible. And the proof is not a slogan. It is an operational trap that snaps shut no matter how clever you are. Because reduction itself is an act of distinction. To reduce A to B, you must distinguish A from not A, B from not B, explanans from explanandum, what counts as success from what counts as failure. So the moment you try to reduce distinction capacity, you must use distinction capacity. The tool is being used to explain the tool. That is the irreducibility. But let's make this felt, not merely stated. The uncuttable atom. Imagine an ancient philosopher holding a grain of sand and saying, "Keep cutting, you'll eventually reach the uncuttable." They called it the atom, not our modern atom, but atomos, the uncuttable. Now imagine someone walks in and says, no, your uncuttable is not really uncuttable. It's made of parts. I can cut it. They bring knives. They bring lasers. They bring precision blades. And then you notice something strange. Every tool they bring assumes the very distinction they are trying to deny. Cut versus not cut. Part versus whole. Separate versus together. Before versus after. Their demonstration depends on the ability to draw a boundary. But phi is not a piece of stuff that sits inside boundaries. Phi is what makes the drawing of boundaries possible. So the proposed reduction has a hidden dependency. To show that phi is made of parts, you must already be able to distinguish part from whole. To define more basic, you must already be able to distinguish basic from derived. To say this explains that, you must already be able to distinguish explanation from what is explained. So the attempt to cut the uncuttable uses the uncuttable. That is the first feel of the theorem. Phi is the atom that makes cutting meaningful. What reduction really means. Let's demystify the word that causes so much confusion. A reduction is a claim like this. A is really B. And it wants B to be 1, more primitive than A, 2, sufficient to generate A, 3, not presupposing A. That third condition is the key. If B secretly presupposes A, the reduction is circular. If I say, sleep is really the need to sleep, I have said nothing. I've just walked in a circle. A successful reduction removes a dependency. It doesn't disguise it. Now apply this to phi. A successful reduction of phi would require some x such that x does not presuppose distinction, yet x produces distinction, and x still supports public testability. That is an extraordinary demand, because public testability itself is structured by distinction. Test condition A versus test condition B. Prediction versus observation. Pass versus fail. So the theorem says, any attempted reduction of phi has only two outcomes. 1. Circularity. Your X uses phi-like distinction concepts. 2. Inexpressibility. Your X avoids all distinction concepts and becomes scientifically mute. There is no third door. The dictionary that cannot define word. Consider a dictionary. It defines thousands of words. It is magnificent. But now pick a word so basic that definitions begin to wobble. Pick the word. Word. Try to define word without using words. A word is a unit of language. But unit is a word. Language is a word. A word is a sound with meaning. But sound is a word. Meaning is a word. A word is something you say, but something and say are words. No matter how you try, you remain inside language. Now someone says, fine, word is really just air vibrations. But vibration means a pattern changing over time. Pattern versus not pattern. This vibration versus that vibration. Signal versus noise. Even this reduction uses distinction structure. So what happened? Word wasn't reducible to non-language without bringing language-like distinctions back in. Not because the reducer is stupid, because the reducer is using the very medium they want to step beneath. Now translate this directly. Phi is the word of all science. It is the condition of meaningful differentiation. So any attempt to define phi in a language that does not already contain distinction capacity is like trying to define word without words. Either you smuggle the thing back in, or you cannot speak at all. The falsification challenge. A firewall becomes science only if it dares the knife. So here is the falsification challenge for part 46. Falsification target. Reduce phi to a more primitive x without using distinction concepts, while still preserving operational testability and public science. In plain language, give me a deeper primitive than phi that can still license measurement, prediction, and comparison, without secretly relying on comparison. If someone can do that, part 46 falls. Now watch what happens when we attempt it. Attempted reductions. The battery. Attempt 1. Phi is really information. This one is popular. But information is not a magic substance. Information begins only when there are distinguishable states. This message versus that message. One bit versus another. Signal versus noise. No distinction, no information. So phi is really information translates immediately into phi is really distinction capacity, which is just phi again. Circular, not deeper. Attempt 2. Phi is really computation. Computation requires input versus output, state A versus state B, rule applied versus rule not applied. A computer that cannot distinguish states cannot compute. So phi is really computation means phi is really the capacity for state distinction, which is phi. Circular. Attempt 3. Phi is really quantum superposition. Superposition sounds like a mystical foundation, but superposition requires basis, states distinguished from one another. This eigenstate versus that eigenstate. Measurement outcomes compared. Even to say superposition, you have already invoked a space of distinguishable alternatives. And operationally, you cannot extract superposition without a measurement protocol that compares predicted distributions to observed outcomes. So again, it uses phi-like structure. Circular. Attempt 4. Phi is really mathematics. Mathematics is built out of distinction from its first breath. 1 versus 2. Member versus not member. Equal versus not equal. True versus false. So phi is really mathematics is like saying the ground of distinction is a language whose first tool is distinction. Circular again. Attempt 5. Phi is really causation. Causation requires cause distinguished from effect, earlier distinguished from later, intervention distinguished from non-intervention. You cannot even state causation without comparison, so it presupposes phi. Attempt 6. Phi is really consciousness. This sounds like a way out. Put mind at the foundation. But consciousness, even in its simplest sense, has contrasts. Aware versus not aware. This experience versus that experience. Foreground versus background. If someone tries to rescue it by saying pure awareness without objects, they face the second failure mode. How do you test it publicly without distinguishing experimental conditions? How do you compare outcomes? How do you communicate it? Either it becomes untestable and private, operationally mute, or it reintroduces distinctions. So it collapses into one of the two predicted failures, circularity or silence. Attempt 7. Phi is really the absolute, the void, suchness, pure being. These are ancient, powerful words. But notice, every one of them gains its meaning by contrast. Absolute versus relative. Void versus plenum. Being versus non-being. Suchness versus not suchness. The very attempt to point to them uses distinctions. If someone says, it is beyond all distinctions, then we ask, can it license measurement? Can it produce predictions? Can it be falsified? If not, then it is not a ground for public science. It may be poetry or private metaphysics, but it cannot function as the scientific floor we are building. So again, two failure modes, no escape. The battery keeps returning the same verdict because the trap is structural. Every phi is really X either translates into phi or vanishes into the unspeakable. The mirror that cannot explain. Reflection without reflecting. Imagine a perfect mirror. It reflects everything placed before it. Someone says, the mirror is not fundamental. Reflection is really silver on glass. But silver reflects. Glass reflects. This explanation uses reflectivity to explain reflectivity. Try again. It's really just atoms arranged in a certain way. But arranged means one arrangement versus another arrangement. Difference is already at work. The mirror cannot explain reflection without invoking the very capacity that makes reflection intelligible. Phi is that mirror power in the conceptual realm, the ability to reflect differences, to host distinctions. You cannot explain difference-making without difference-making. Either you reuse it or you lose it. The translation test. Suppose you try to translate the word difference into a language that has no concept of difference. How would you do it? You would need to say something like, difference means not the same. But not the same is already a difference concept. So either the target language already has distinction capacity, meaning phi is already there, or the translation fails. This is the same as our theorem. Any attempt to translate phi into a deeper primitive either keeps phi implicitly or becomes untranslatable into public discourse. Phi is the grammar that all translation requires. The deep reason in one sentence. Here is the formal heart, said simply. Reduction is a comparison procedure. Comparison procedures require phi. Therefore, any reduction of phi uses phi. That's the whole mechanism. It doesn't depend on a specific philosophy. It depends on the operational meaning of reduce. If you want a reduction that does not compare, you no longer have reduction. You have silence. Why this is not just human limitation? A listener might object. Maybe we can't reduce phi because our minds are limited. No. This seal is not about how clever we are. It is about what it means for a claim to become public. Public science requires defined test conditions, a comparator chain, repeatable procedures, an observable outcome, a pass-fail criterion, replication. Every one of these is distinction-laden. So even if you imagine a superintelligence or a godlike mathematician, if they want public science, science that can be shared, audited, replicated, they must cash out in comparisons. And comparisons presuppose phi. So irreducibility is not a weakness of the human brain. It is a structural property of public testability. The two failure modes restated as a firewall. Now we can state the irreducibility theorem as a clean firewall you can use instantly. Whenever you hear phi is really x, ask two questions. Does x contain distinctions? Does it rely on difference, state, relation, pattern, identity, truth, information, structure, or any contrast? If yes, then X uses phi-like machinery. The reduction is circular. It's not deeper, it's a redescription. If X claims to avoid all distinctions, can X be tested publicly? Can you design a replicable measurement protocol using X? Can you compare prediction with outcome? If no, then X is operationally mute. It cannot ground public science. It falls out of the domain of certified knowledge. Either way, the reduction fails as a deeper foundation. That is the exhaustiveness of part 45 reappearing inside part 46, but now sharpened into irreducibility. Because this is firewalled science, we state the prediction plainly. Prediction. Every future attempt to reduce phi, every future phi is really x, will end in one of two outcomes. 1. It will translate back into phi language, circularity. 2. It will fail to license public testability, inexpressibility, non-science. This prediction is not mystical. It is a structural expectation, and it is testable in a very practical way. Watch the next grand final theory announcement. Watch the next Consciousness is Fundamental manifesto. Watch the next Everything is Information book. Ask, where is the comparator chain? Where is the measurement license? Where is the distinction that turns words into public facts? They will either use it, thereby admitting phi, or they will avoid it and become poetry. The ethical consequence, a guardrail against reductionist hubris. There is an ethical reason this seal matters. Reduction is powerful, and power often turns into arrogance. People begin to say, everything reduces to my favorite thing. Everything reduces to physics. Everything reduces to computation. Everything reduces to evolution. Everything reduces to information. Everything reduces to consciousness. Part 46 does not deny the usefulness of reduction inside the world. It denies something subtler. You cannot reduce the conditions of reduction without using those conditions. So part 46 is a humility engine. It tells us, be bold about reducing phenomena within a licensed window. But do not pretend you can reduce the ground that makes licensing possible. That is not scientific confidence. That is category error. The bridge back to the architecture. Now watch how part 46 locks perfectly into our previous seals. Part 42, pure capacity seal. Phi has 0 internal degrees, no knobs, no constants. Irreducibility fits. If there were internal knobs, you might imagine reducing them to smaller knobs. But pure capacity is not a gadget. It is the possibility of gadgets. Part 44. Metaphysical necessity. Questioning phi uses phi. Irreducibility strengthens this. Reducing phi uses phi. Not only can you not stand outside phi to deny it, you cannot stand outside phi to explain it away. Part 45. Exhaustiveness. Any deeper foundation either smuggles phi or goes silent. Irreducibility shows the mechanism. Reduction is itself a phi operation. So the deeper move is blocked at the level of method, not just at the level of metaphysics. This is why your architecture feels like a vault. Each seal is not a new claim, it is a reinforcing lock. A final analogy, the ocean and the net. Imagine someone standing at the shore holding a fishing net. They say, I will capture the ocean with this net. I will reduce the ocean into what my net contains. But the net is supported by the ocean. The net's shape, the net's wetness, the net's weight, the very fact it can be moved, all of it occurs inside the ocean's world. A net can catch fish. A net can catch shells. A net can catch pieces of seaweed. But the net cannot catch the ocean that holds the net. Phi is like that ocean. You can reduce many things inside phi. You can map, compress, model, and reconstruct. But you cannot reduce the capacity for distinction without using the capacity for distinction. The net cannot capture the sea it floats in. The carry forward. So hold the listener carry as a single sentence you can use anywhere. Reducing phi uses phi. When someone says, phi is really X, you do not need to argue endlessly. You do not need to fight metaphysical wars. You only need to apply the firewall. If X is speakable and usable, it will contain distinctions. Thus, it already stands on phi. If X avoids all distinctions, it becomes unusable for public science. Thus, it cannot replace phi as the ground. Either way, phi remains irreducible, and this prepares the final step. Because if phi cannot be reduced, and nothing deeper can replace it, then the only remaining responsible move is not to search below phi, but to verify what we have above it. In the next part, we complete the backpack check. We proved that before differentiation, the silent ground already contains every prerequisite for a readable universe, without smuggling in dynamics, units, constants, or extra primitives. Then, and only then, we earn the right to let the story begin. Search Holophase on Zenodo. Always peace be upon you.